Hey YouTube! It's Farah and Rana, and we're back again today to tell you an in-depth review of Persepolis the movie, which came out in 2007.
So basically, it's a French animated movie, and it discusses the life of a young Iranian woman during the Persian Revolution.
For those of you who have no idea what we're talking about, the protagonist, Marjan, is born into a communist family in Iran before the revolution, and she's a bit rebellious. She starts listening to Iron Maiden and Michael Jackson. She wears a denim jacket over her burqa. So basically she gets into a lot of trouble. Her family decides to send her off to Vienna, Austria. From then on we begin our story.
Not to blab on, but Marjan puts the viewer through a bit of a whirlwind with her story. Her choices and personality are a bit rash and hasty and kind of ill-thought. The purpose of creating the film in cartoon is to eliminate any racial labels because animation will kind of moderate the culture, as seeing the cartoon is not as real as actors.
So the first thing you're going to notice is that the movie in the present tense is in color, while her flashbacks are all in black and white. This serves to remind the viewer which is which, and the fact that it is in black and white probably makes the past feel a bit dreary or tragic.
At the very beginning of the movie, Marjan is in the Paris-Orly airport, and we see her field of view slowly zoom into the flight board where it says Tehran, her hometown. Immediately thereafter, she ties her headscarf on, and this is probably meant to show how her awareness of what is appropriate and inappropriate comes into play. It shows her emotional transition from Vienna to Tehran, as her awareness of what she can or cannot do is shown. Her own expression is kind of obedient and compliant. She doesn't look convinced of what she's doing, but kind of strained.
In the bathroom where Marjan applies her headscarf, a European woman is next to her at the sink, and she's putting on her lipstick, and she gives her this kind of disgusted glance. So the unconfined white woman is viewing the Middle Eastern one as the typical extremist, uneducated, and oppressed Muslim woman. Just the act of Marjan wearing her headscarf brought all the stereotypical ideas of a Muslim woman back into the white woman's thoughts. A last revolted glance is thrown at Marjan as she leaves the airport bathroom.
At minute 2:48, Marjan sits at the airport terminal, and she looks pretty fed up, and she's sitting down as if she looks really depressed, and she's not even smoking her cigarette. She's just letting it burn out while the camera focuses in on her, and the background gets darker and gloomier, and she starts reflecting on her old memories, which is like sort of a foreshadowing of like a new flashback. And then she starts hearing her grandmother's voice in her head, and she's contemplating what brought her to this point in life.
And the black and white cartoon version of herself walks right past present-day Marjan into a whole new flashback. She's laughing and she runs into her mother's arms at a new scene in a new airport where she's welcoming her family back from Paris. She's asking her mom a whole bunch of questions at once. She's not really waiting for the answers. She's just very excited and joyful as any other normal kid would be. And her expression is innocent and optimistic. And as a child, she has this very unique sense of humor, and this embraces how carefree she was. She was completely different from her adult self we see at the beginning of the movie.
She even says, as a child, she says, back then I had a quiet life, a little girl's life. So she's reminiscing on what she used to have versus what she has now. It's not clear whether she blames herself for this or the country, but she also says, I had two obsessions, to shave my legs and to become the last prophetess. So her ambitions were kind of childish and innocent, and this kind of makes you, again, compare the Marjan who's smoking at the airport terminal versus little Marjan, who you see at the beginning of her flashback. Even as she was explaining to her grandmother what she would do as a prophetess, her ambitions were childish and unrealistic, but she did have an awareness of the world around her, and that things were not perfect like she wanted them to be, and that they needed to be fixed. One of the ways she tried to fix this later on is she was trying to beat up the little boy whose father killed communists. So when her and her friends see the boy riding his bicycle down the street, as soon as Marjan suggests that they chase him down and gouge his eyes out with nails, the children's eyebrows thicken and furrow, and they have really exaggerated smiles, and they look kind of evil. And they're doing this because everyone around them has this nationalistic spirit, which the children can't help being affected by, and basically causes them to be more rebellious.
So the swan her uncle gave her the night he told her his story, it's a symbol of what he told her itself, which is to always have hope in your family and the country and to never forget where you come from. Which takes us way back to the beginning of the movie when Marjan is sitting at the airport terminal and she hears her mother's voice inside her head when she says that she always has to be loyal to who she is. So clearly her uncle and her grandmother play a very large role in her life. And he was kind of like her role model. She saw him as a hero and she always compared his time in jail with her friend's dad's time in jail. And she was very proud that he was in jail for longer because to her it meant that he was persistent for longer.
Her uncle was fighting against the oppression of the Islamic State. Well, not only the state, but the whole way of thought that the people lived by. For example, in the scene where Marjan's mother was talking to their neighbor, who was angry that her son was being taken away to fight with the promises of heaven, the neighbor was beginning to question her own faith. But when Marjan's father came in, she quickly covered up her hair and put on her headscarf, and she started looking downwards and shaking her head and lowering her voice like she was ashamed or embarrassed.
Yes, and Marjan's mother asks her neighbor, why is she doing this, and she's shocked at her neighbor's reaction, which shows how Marjan's family and her family's morals aren't exactly conservative, even though they live in a society where it's kind of required to be conservative and they could get executed for being otherwise. You can also see this when they go out to secret parties and they get caught with alcohol and they have to throw it all away. This affects Marjan the most because being raised in a family of liberal people made Marjan herself more free-spirited and less conservative or tied down to rules and religion than others, even though her society around her is extremely conservative. Even Marjan's uncle, who used to make them wine in secret by pressing the grapes, is very liberal, but his maid, who was made to actually crush the grapes, was saying while she did that, may God forgive me, may God forgive me. So she wasn't really very convinced of what she was doing, but unlike Marjan and her family, who were more open-minded and less religious.
Yeah, and the culture in Tehran is opposed to the culture in Europe. It allowed Marjan more freedom than what she would have than she would have normally had. But in the scene where she goes to a concert with her newfound rebel friends in Europe, she stands still and she doesn't dance or move. She feels kind of awkward. Then, she feels uncomfortable. But it's almost as if she's too rebellious for Iran, but not defined enough by European standards.
Then, when Marjan meets Marcus, she falls head over heels in love, and she may have done things with him that in a conservative state would be considered not exactly ethical. Later on, when Marjan returns to Iran as a result of her breakup, people ask her if she's a virgin. Society as a whole isolates her and they don't treat her as if she's one of their own. She's seen as a foreigner, a whore, a sinner, and this is obvious when you take into consideration how she isolated herself. She didn't feel like she was part of the Iranian crowd, so now Marjan is the ugly duckling. She isn't European, and she isn't Iranian either.
But as a European person, this is what they consider normal. Rather than Marjan being a whore or otherwise, this is Marjan finally gaining her freedom. They see it as her breaking away from her formal constraints and living what they view as a normal life, completely different from what her family and friends back home think.
So basically, the entire movie discusses Marjan's struggle between her nation's conservative nature and her more liberal side, which on a bigger scale discusses Iran's political instability between the old and new regime. However, Marjan must remember the swan her uncle gave her. She must remember that although it may be hard or she may not fully understand it, she must remain loyal to her family and true to herself. She's someone who doesn't necessarily fit into either of these very strenuous categories.
Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below.
Bye!
Bye!